Hello, welcome to week 4 of school. This week we are going to look at Study Skills 101, and actually we're just going to do part 1 today, and it's a really important part, and that has to do with vocabulary. Now, I know that you have vocabulary associated with every single one of your subjects, that there's certain words that you need to be able to know and to use and remember, especially if you're, for instance, taking a foreign language and trying to learn a new language. There's lots and lots of stuff, and vocabulary is important. How many times have you studied the night before a test, and then you go in and you do okay on the test, and then the next week you're supposed to use that word, and you're like, what was that again? I don't remember that one. Okay. That's because the majority of students, and I'm not just talking middle school students, I'm actually talking college students as well, do not study very efficiently. The strategies, or almost lack thereof, that they use are not really that good at putting it into your long-term memory, making it so that you can remember things past the next quiz, past the next test, those sorts of things. And so today I want to talk to you a little bit about that stuff. Like, how do I study vocabulary so that I'm more likely to remember it, not just for the quiz, but for the future, because it's things that I want to be able to use and know. And if I don't, it may cause me issues later on. Okay, so I'm going to start by telling you why one of the strategies that people use all the time, and it's an okay jumping off point, isn't actually that effective. And so let's take, you've got a list of words. Let's say we got 10 vocabulary words, and you start writing the definitions down from the back of the book. Okay, I am sure you have had that assignment. I've had that assignment. I've given that assignment. Okay. But if that's all we do, we're not going to remember it. And I want to talk about brain power, and I want to show you why that's not really effective with this story. It is actually a true story, but the names will be protected I won't tell you those. But a teacher I worked with a while ago had given an assignment. It was like 10 or 12 vocabulary words, and they had the back of the book, and kids were copying down the definitions from the glossary, and he was walking around to make sure that nobody was off task and everything. And he walks by the student and he goes, "Oh, I didn't know you spoke Spanish." And the kid looks up at him and goes, "I don't speak Spanish. Like, what are you talking about?" That student had copied the definitions. He was almost done with all the vocabulary words from the Spanish glossary in the back of the book instead of the English one. Now, he didn't speak Spanish or read Spanish, and that kind of shows you right there how much brain power he was using to copy. When you just copy things, you're not actually thinking about it. And if you're not really putting much effort into it, that means that your brain isn't putting much effort into remembering it. So it's not an effective strategy. Even if you sit there and you copy it down 10 times, it's really not an effective strategy in the long terms. Now, it's good to know those things, to have the definitions, to write them down in the first place. But if that's where you stop, that's it. You're not going to do very well. So one of the strategies that's actually the most effective is something called interleaved practice. I know, it sounds really official and it sounds complicated. It isn't. Basically, instead of studying words in isolation, you study them together. You look at them, you compare them, you see the similarities and differences between the two, and you're way more likely to remember it. Why is that? Because you're using more of your brain. Your brain is working harder to learn those 2 words or those 3 words or those 4 words, which means that you're more likely to remember it in the long term because you've put more effort into it. And actually, I've been having you do this since the beginning of school. If you think about that first week with the fixed mindset and the growth mindset, I didn't give you just growth mindset to learn about. I gave you 2 words, and you looked at examples of how they were similar and different, and really just mostly different. What were the differences? You looked at Sam and Mia and looked at how, if they were given a problem, how somebody like Sam with a fixed mindset would react versus Mia with a growth mindset would react. Because we took the time to compare and look at the two of them, I'm guessing right now most of you, if not all, could in fact explain to me the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. Okay, we did the same thing with recall versus recognition, or proactive versus reactive. Instead of studying the words in isolation, we're studying them together. And this is really important because it is how you are going to memorize and be able to use vocabulary much easier. One of the examples that we've been talking about in some of the live lessons is the word equivalent. And when I talk about it, you will notice I'll write it down, I'll underline the prefix, and then I'm going to start writing other words, both math words and non-math words, and talking about how those things are similar. I'm comparing these words, I'm looking for similarities, I'm thinking about the definitions of these words, I'm not learning them in isolation. And that makes a huge difference, okay? This also actually applies to studying for math. How many times have you been fine on the individual practices that you do for learning a unit? Let's say a unit on decimals. You do add decimals, then you do subtract decimals, then you do multiply decimals, you do divide decimals, you got the whole thing, you're all ready for the test, you get on the test, and it's like, what just happened? I don't remember. Am I supposed to, what was I supposed to do with that again? And then you start to stress and the test doesn't go very well. It's because of interleaved practice. If you only practice skills in isolation, if you know you're just doing adding decimals, for instance, and your brain knows that you're just doing adding decimals, after the first couple of problems, you kind of start to go on autopilot because you already know what the procedure is going to do. To solve it, your brain isn't going to take a bunch of time to be like, oh, well, should I do this or this? You're having trouble on the test because you have to switch between things. You have to evaluate a problem and decide the procedure. But if you're only practicing one skill at a time and you're not practicing them together, your brain doesn't have to work that hard after the first problem or two, which is why you struggle on the test. So this idea of interleave practice, not only does it work for vocabulary, it works for math. If you have to decide how to work between different problems and that's how you practice, then your test will go much better because that's generally what tests are. If that's been you in the past, it doesn't mean that you're like just going into a fixed mindset and saying something like you're dumb, because again, it's not true. It just means that you didn't study in a way that was conducive to doing well on the test, because your brain didn't have to make those decisions between how to do different types of things until you actually got on the test. But if you instead practice a variety of problems so your brain has to switch between those different concepts before you get to the test, that means the test is going to go much better because you've already been practicing that. Your brain has figured out how to decide when you should do this, when you should do this, and it's going to go much smoother, okay? So the next time you have to study vocabulary, don't study words one at a time. Study them together. Look at the differences, look at the similarities, and I promise you that things are going to go much better, okay? So, one more example, and I'm going to take a non-math example. One of the things that people confuse, okay, I think there's only one M, but there may be two. Spelling is not my strong suit, and I'll look it up afterwards. But when you look at immigrate and emigrate, one means you're coming into a country and one means you're leaving a country. These are two terms that even adults confuse a lot, okay? This isn't just one of those kind of things. But if I start to look at these in terms of some other words, you will notice I. Interior, import means you're bringing it in. Immigration, you're coming into the country. Those words that begin with I seem to be things that are inside or going inside. And the things that begin with E, exterior, export, emigrate, all are things that are going out. So if I were trying to memorize the difference between immigrate and emigrate so that I didn't mix it up, I might actually start to look at other words as well, and I might notice that pattern, and it would help me remember that immigrate, import, interior, all of those things have to do with inside or going into something, and export, exterior, and emigrate would have to go with the outside. Okay, that's just another example from social studies. Like when I taught US history, that's one of the things that we talked about, because again, if you understand that if you look at words together and not in isolation, that you're much more likely to remember them. It's going to help you immensely. And a lot of times when you experience stress, it's because you don't understand the vocabulary because you've forgotten. Okay, so I hope this helps, and I will talk to you soon.